There are many issues that divide Christians, Christ followers, and even scholars. That we call them theology or doctrine is a fancy word for them. But in regular terms, it may be things that we hear about or hear other churches do, or there's all these things that can divide us in the church world. A pastor I used to follow closely had a really good way of putting it. On issues that divide us, there should be what we call open-handed issues and closed-handed issues. All right, so open-handed or closed-handed. Open-handed issues are things that we may disagree with on an interpretation. We may not see eye to eye on something. Those are open-handed issues because we can say, hey, we can disagree, but we still love each other. We can do life together. We can go to church together. All those things. Closed-handed issues are things that would and should separate us. Like closed-handed issues would be somebody that messes with the doctrine of the Trinity, right? Like we're not going to do an outreach event with a church that doesn't believe in the Trinity. We're not going to do an outreach event or a co-worship service together with a church that doesn't believe that it's salvation by faith alone, right? Like those are closed-handed issues that we would say these are important. These are very, very important for us as Christ followers to hold on to. These are foundational issues. In the way of theology, what this really is saying is we don't need to major on the minors. We don't need to major on the minors. And that doesn't mean that all those things aren't important. Listen, I love theology. I love to read and study and all the things. It's not that it is not important. What it is saying, though, is that there are things that should separate us and there are things that should not separate us. Today, we're going to be covering one of what I would call an open-handed issue. All right, so you have closed-handed issues, open-handed. This is an open-handed issue that, depending on your background, and we'll talk about some of that here in a little bit, but we're going to talk about this morning healing or the miracles of God. Healing or the miracles of God. Now, depending on your church background, your upbringing, or maybe even your study, you may have differing opinions. There may be people that land in different camps about different issues on the idea of God's miracle-working power, that he's able to work miracles today in our lives. And I'm talking like real miracles, right? Like people coming back to life, people being healed from cancer, all the things that we would look at and say like, hey, that's pretty cool, or that scares us, or wherever we land on the map, right? Today we're covering one of those issues, and so this should be an open-handed issue, even if we disagree, but I don't think you'll disagree with me. What I want to do this morning, though, as we talk about healing and the miracle-working power of God, is I want to walk into the tension a little bit. I want to walk into the tension a little bit. Now, have you ever walked into a tense conversation that you were not a part of, but you walked into it and you're like, oh, and you just kind of do the like step back out of the room? You know that conversation? There's this tension, right? You walk in, you're like, did not want that in my life. Instead of walking backwards, I want us to lean into it a little bit this morning. All right? I'm going to build the tension. You ready? Here's the tension. All of us more than likely have prayed for someone to be healed, and God didn't heal them the way that we wanted him to heal them. We've probably experienced that, right? We see things all the time that these stories go viral, and you start to see like, hey, it seems like the whole country's praying for this one thing, and it doesn't change, right? In the way that we would say change should take place, right? You might have somebody in your life right now that is walking through very difficult circumstances, and it may even be you. Someone passing away from cancer, or somebody with a brain injury that you're waiting at the hospital and praying for brain activity on the next scan. Like, these are the things that we're talking about. We're praying, and you muster up all the faith that you can, and you're calling on the promises of God like we just sang about, yet it doesn't seem to happen the way that we want it to. Instead of ignoring that pain, because that can be the temptation for us, is that we want to just ignore almost like, well, God's a healer and God's a miracle worker, and we almost like take the things that didn't happen the way that we wanted to, and we take the pain and we just shove it off to the side, and we're just not going to talk about that because we want to focus on the positive. But the reality is we have feelings. God knows we have feelings, and here's what I want to encourage you with this morning. God can even handle your doubt. He's a good God. He can walk you through those situations. And so as we talk about this biblical view of healing power, God's healing power, his miraculous power, and we want to lean into the tension a little bit because it's healthy. The name that we're studying this morning is Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals. If you're new at this, we've been in a study for the last, 8 weeks or so, studying the names of God, the compound names of God. and we are looking at these names, and we're seeing that his names reveal his character to us. He's the Lord who heals. He's the Lord our shepherd. He's the Lord that fights for us. He's our warrior. He's our banner that we hold up in the middle of the battle. All the things that we've studied, we've seen the character of God revealed, and it's almost like this mirror. I don't know if you can feel it. It's like you have this idea of who God is and all the names and the character of God, and then we put ourselves up to it, and we can quickly realize we fall woefully short when it comes to who God is and his goodness and his character, and which in turn makes you appreciate his grace even more. Exodus chapter 15, if you have your Bibles, is where we're going to be this morning. Exodus chapter 15, if you don't have it, it'll be on the screen as well. We're going to be at the end, the last passage of Exodus 15, chapter 22 through 27. And then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water because the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. It's a little repetitive. You get it, right? 24. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw the log into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, "If you will diligently listen to my voice, to the voice of the Lord your God, and do which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and to keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. I am Jehovah Rapha." Verse 27, and then he came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palms, and they encamped there by the water. Now, this is I don't know if your kids are like mine, but I know that sometimes our kids, they come in from outside playing, and what is it, like they come in, they're like, "Oh, I'm like dehydrated, I'm so hot, I'm so thirsty, I've got to have water." And it's like they're just pounding water, just going for it. Water's on the floor because they're getting it out of the refrigerator, just making a big mess because what? There's like this desire of like, I've got to fill my body up because I feel dehydrated. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with water drinkers or not. Anybody like a real water drinker? Where you at? Thank you. Did you know that there are different types of tasting water? I didn't know this. This is a real thing. Real water people know that you don't ever drink Dasani. Right? If you're here, you're like, "I'm a water drinker, I drink Dasani." You're not a water drinker, I just want to tell you. It's horrible, right? You don't drink Aquafina. Some of y'all are like, that's my favorite. I don't know why he's going after me this morning. But you notice, right? You notice like there's this idea of good water and bad water. You can taste it. It's like, like when the water filter in your house is getting just a little bit like past this due date, you're like, it's not as crisp, right? Did you know that they're starting to put water sommeliers in restaurants now? Do y'all even know what a sommelier is? Like, is that okay, you know what a wine sommelier is? Like, okay, can we just be honest in the room? You go to a restaurant, fancy restaurant, and they say, you want a glass of wine? They're like, okay, you're going to bring the sommelier out, and they're going to tell you, am I saying that word right, by the way? Okay, good, because I'm acting like I am. And you go in there, and they tell you all the wines, right? Now they have water sommeliers. They come in, and they'll tell you, like, this water has this pH content, and this water has this vitamin content, and you're like, just give me water. Like, I want water. Here's the tension that we're walking in today. We've experienced healing not taking place. But we also see here, God says one of his names is the Lord our healer. There's the tension again. Here's the main idea. God's healing power is not constrained by human action or human plans. God's healing power is not constrained by human action or human plans. I think we probably put way too much stock in human effort when it comes to praying for miracles. It's almost like we feel like God has this quota of how many people actually need to be praying for us for God to actually answer the prayer. If we could get 10,000 people praying, then God's going to answer it, right? Of course, because there's a lot of people praying for it. If we could get this many people, oh yeah, absolutely, he's going to answer it because we got this many people praying for it. We start the prayer chain, something goes on Facebook, you create a Facebook group, and all of a sudden there's thousands of people like it, and you're praying, and that's how God's going to answer the prayer. That's what we would call putting human effort into our prayers for miracles. We treat it as this human responsibility, but healing power is not restricted or directed by human power. So as we go through this, a few things I want to pull out of this passage is, number one, is how do we respond when we find ourselves drinking from a bitter well? How do we respond? How do I respond when we find ourselves drinking from a bitter well? I don't know if you ever met somebody that's bitter. You ever met a bitter person? They usually have this face, this like a bitter face. Like, not because like their face looks a certain way, they're just always like, they got this scowl on their face, right? They're just mad about life. Bitterness. The Israelites came 3 days after crossing the Red Sea to this place called Marah, tired, frustrated, thirsty, and this water was bitter. Exodus chapter 15 again, verse 22. Then Moses set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days, that's important, 3 days, only 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink it because the water was bitter, therefore they named it Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Marah, it's repetitive because Marah in Hebrew means bitter. That's where that's coming from. But what did the people do when they got to Marah? What's the story of the Israelites? Complaining. They complain all the time. They're the most complaining people in the world. They complain about what seems to be like everything. It's a theme of the story of the people of God all throughout the Old Testament. How easily they would forget the work of God in their lives over and over and over. I mean, 3 days they are in from God doing this miraculous work, and 3 days in, they're like, oh, but God, you just couldn't even give us water. I want you to think about this. 3 days in from crossing the Red Sea on dry ground, God splits the waters. They walk across on dry ground. They watch the waters fold back over the Egyptians as they're pursuing them. We're 3 days out from them watching the powerful hand of God perform miracle after miracle against Egypt and Pharaoh, the plagues, and still 3 days out from all those things, the first thing they go to is like, God, come on, could you not do something for us? Now, it's really easy for us to look at the Israelites with 2020 vision, isn't it? Like thousands of years later, like, look at the Israelites, you complaining people. Y'all know where I'm going with that, don't you? Okay, we'll stop there. But here's the reality. If we were to take that mirror of what we're looking at with the Israelites and flip it back on our own hearts and our own souls, and we ask ourselves this question: how do I respond when I find myself at Marah drinking bitter water of life? Is it not easy to go around with complaints? Is it not easy to, like, come on, God, is something else really? Don't you know what kind of year it's been already? Don't you know what my family has already been through this year? You know those feelings, right? Like that's the things that kind of takes place, a thought process in our lives. What happens when we get that diagnosis? What happens when what we're praying for isn't happening the way we want it to? What happens when anxiety or depression sets in and mental health feels like it's something that we can't grasp or get a hold of? Feels elusive. What happens when we drink from the bitter well? God was teaching the Israelites something, and there's a lot for us to learn here as well, is that in the most difficult moments of our lives, we have a choice to make. In the most difficult situations in our lives, we have a choice to make. We can continue to trust in God, or we can go try to find our source of comfort in some other part of life or some other way. We can trust in God, or we can find comfort in other sources. Ken Hemphill says this about miracles, is that difficult circumstances are the platform on which God reveals his supernatural activity. Difficult circumstances are the platform on which God reveals his supernatural activity. He goes on in his book when he talks about the names of God, and he says it a little bit differently. And he says, difficult circumstances don't test an all-powerful God. They test the faith of a powerless people. And maybe that's what the root is. Maybe that's what the root is for us, is that we realize that the areas that we need a miracle or God intervening in a supernatural way, we realize how helpless we really are in this life. And there's something in us, in our human nature, that doesn't like the feeling of being helpless, does it? We don't like being helpless. I mean, you think about like a vehicle wreck. What do they tell you if you ever see a wreck about to happen, or you're about to be in a wreck? What do they tell you? Relax your body, right? No one does that. What do? You're like, you grab the steering wheel harder, just because you know it's about to come, right? Why? Because we want to be in control. We don't like feeling helpless. You go to, this summer's coming up. I grew up in Florida, so it's like, you know all these things, right? You see all the signs like riptide, and you're like, so what do they tell you to do? Like if you're in a riptide, just let the water take you, swim to the side, right? But what does everybody do? They swim against the current because they don't like the feeling of being helpless. There's something in us that doesn't like that feeling being helpless. And sometimes the situations we find ourselves in render us that way. Now I want you to hear me this morning. What I'm not saying is that God is putting the diseases or the sickness on you. Okay? Please understand, that's not what I'm saying. God is not putting the disease or the sickness on you. This is a reality that we live under, is that we are living under the consequences of the fall. From the moment that sin entered this world, we understand and we know there's been consequences of sickness, death. All the things that we experience in life are consequences of fall, the bad things. So God's not making you sick. He's not putting cancer in your family member's body, but he does use it to test us. When we face the waters of Mara, where we realize our helplessness, do we lean into faith? Are we pressing into faith in those moments? The second thing is this. Healing, I believe that healing has been misunderstood in the modern church. I have this picture burned in my mind. I've talked about it often, and I could name names, but I won't name names because that's not the godly thing to do. But I have this thing images burned in my mind of a few televangelists from when I was a child. And a televangelist back in the day, they were on, I don't know if it's just my house, but they were on the TV all the time. And they as they were on, they would do things. They would say, we're going to send you this prayer napkin, and you're going to place it under your pillow, and you're going to be healed. Or there was another one that was really popular, like, we've got this healing water. If you take this water and you drink it, all your ailments will be gone. And here's the thing. They would send it to you if you sent them $29.99, right? You remember those stories? You remember those things? There's this kind of this idea of like, when we think about healing, some of us go to like the hokey world to where it's like, I don't know about that. That feels a little bit off. It feels a little bit like there's no purpose in doctrine or theology. They're just kind of living out in this world where they've made healing the be-all, end-all. They've kind of tried to build their ministry off of healing. You might even see like there's been stories of people that are stretching healing stories. There was a few years ago, me and Lindsay were just talking about this. There's a song it's called You Are My Healer. Hillsong and Planet Shakers, they all, they produced this song, and it was incredible. It was written by this guy that told everybody that he had cancer and he was healed from cancer. The problem was, he never had cancer. So that's the kind of stuff that goes on in our minds. It's like, wait a second, like we know that there's fake stuff that's happening. We know there's some hokey stuff going on. So where is God actually moving in a miraculous way? Where does that land in our lives, in our theology today? Let's look at verse 25. It says, and he cried out to the Lord. Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. The Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put in the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. Notice a couple quick things. I will not put any of the diseases that I put on the Egyptians, right? This is clarifying the point earlier. God is not putting the diseases on you. He did put them on the Egyptians. That was for a purpose. But for his people, for his faithful followers, he is not putting diseases on people for any reason. That's not what we believe. So he tests the Israelites, and he basically tells them, have I not done enough already? Have you already forgotten the work that I've done? Have you not seen my powerful hand? 3 days ago, you just walked across the sea on dry ground. So I don't know how you could be forgetting so quickly. And he uses this bitter water as a test, and he tells them, in short, what and this is the Derek paraphrase version, what you thought the water would bring, you should have been looking to God for the whole time. Refreshment. Strength. Because as his name says, he alone is Jehovah Rapha. Now, when we talk about healing, we know that, I shared this earlier, is that people fall kind of all over the map when it comes to the issue. So I want to bring some clarity about what we're talking about here. So these are subpoints to point number 2. I have like 12 points this morning. You just keep taking notes. First subpoint is this, is that healing is not a gift that humans use at will. Healing is not a gift that humans use at will. Now, what I mean by that is this, is we can sometimes equate the gift of healing, and we put them and kind of co-opt them together with the gifts of the Spirit, like spiritual gifts, like teaching or mercy. We kind of wrap healing in the middle of that. Healing is a manifestation of God's Spirit, but no one walks around with the gift of healing. It is God moving in his power and his will. So I want to be clear on that as we move through this. There's only one person that owns the market on healing, and it's not human power. The manifestations of the Spirit, in my opinion, and in my study, are different from the gifts of the Spirit in this distinction, meaning this. If someone had the gift of healing, they could walk around and they could just walk through every hospital in Houston and just boom, 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 shut the hospital down, right? That would be the gift of healing if God was to impart gifts of healing in that way. Now, when you have the gift of teaching, what you don't have to do is you don't have to conjure something up, do you? It flows naturally out of you, right? Teaching it's a gift, and so it just comes out. If you have the gift of mercy, you walk around giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. Don't you? Like, oh, they're just a good-hearted person. And then you have cynical people like me, where you're like, I don't know. Those gifts come naturally. The manifestations of the Spirit are not something that we walk around. To my power, there's been no one in the history of the world other than Jesus that walked around with that kind of power, just touching people to heal them. Now, can God do it? Absolutely, right? He can do it. But that's not how this gifting works, at least in my study. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 talks about this a little bit. We're going to put it on the screen there. It says this, verse 4. Now there are various gifts, but of the same Spirit. And there are various varieties of service, but the same Lord. There are varieties of activities, but the same God who empowers them in all and everyone. To each is given the manifestation, that's the key word. Each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. My problem with people that walk around with a healing ministry is it usually makes them look better than making God look good. You see the difference? This is for the common good, for the good of the people, for the good of God's people, for the good of evangelism. For to one is given through the spirit of utterance of wisdom, and to another utterance of knowledge, according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by one Spirit, to another working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. Verse 11, here's the key. All of those are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills, as God wills, as the Spirit wills. Notice who they're empowered by. Not by man. They're empowered by the will of God. The second subpoint is this, is that we unapologetically believe that God still heals today. I want to make that clear today. I'm kind of going hard on the hyper side, right? But I want to make it clear, we believe as a church that God can still work miracles in our lives today. And so we can read, I have great friends that disagree with me on this. They believe that the gifts of the Spirit and healing and miraculous powers were given to the apostles for the spreading of the church. And once the apostles died off, right, the gifts of the Spirit were ceased in that way. But here's what I would say. As we read early church fathers, one of those is Augustine of Hippo. In his book, he was originally a skeptic of the miracle-working power of God. In the 3rd century, he wrote a book called The City of God. And he writes often about the miracles that were taking place in the early church in the 3rd century. We see Origen, Tertullian, the list goes on of early church fathers way past the life of the apostles that are saying, hey, God is doing a work in this city. There's people getting radically saved. There's miracles taking place. Like there's demons being cast out. All the things that in the American church we'd be like, whoo, we don't do that. They're saying this is taking place. Here's where we miss it sometimes today. I think, yes, I know and believe God can heal anyone he wants, anywhere he wants. But according to James, it should mostly take place in the context of the church. James chapter 5. Let's turn there real quick. It says this in verse 13, is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he'll be forgiven. Two reasons that I believe, why would God want to see miracles in the church? There's two reasons here, for community and for accountability. Community and accountability. Community, this, right? Meaning this is that, could you imagine walking with somebody that is walking through something so difficult, and we're shouldering that burden together because we're walking in community, and the Lord does a miraculous work in somebody's life? What kind of celebration is going to take place? Right? What kind of faith building is it? It's going to be like, wow, look at what God has done. We've been praying for this. And we've seen God do even miracles in our church. And not to inflate things and make things crazy, but Francois and Swanee. Today's our last Sunday. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, but I don't remember which baby it was. Her baby turned breech, and she called Lindsay and I and Josh and Sarah, and what was it? Malia, their second baby. And they called us, and it's like right before her due date, and we go in and we pray, and she goes back to the doctor, the baby flipped, and I know some people might look at that and say, well, that's not really a miracle. Babies turn all the time. But I know what it looked like before, and I know what it looked like after. So, but community accountability, the accountability part is this. It'd be pretty hard to conjure up a fake miracle when you're accountable to other people, wouldn't it? It's like, oh, I got healed, my back pain's gone. It's like, you were playing basketball last night, weren't you? Like, that's hard to do, right? Like, it's hard to fake something in accountability. I need to keep going because I'm going to say something that's going to get me in trouble. Number 3. God's ultimate healing is spiritual healing. God's ultimate healing is our spiritual healing. When I was a young youth pastor, I was 20 years old. I looked like I was 12. And I grew up in ministry. My dad's a music pastor. My grandfather is a pastor. Grown up around the church. But I went to Bible college, did the whole thing. But I didn't have like hands-on training, right? So I'm 20 years old. I'm working at our first job as a youth pastor. Our pastor was one of the most godly men. He is a true shepherd. Just like kindest soul. I'm like, I learned so much from him about loving people and shepherding people. He was out of town, and he called me and said, hey, there's a lady in the church, so-and-so, sister so-and-so, because that's what you used to say about people in the church back in the day, right? It's like sister so-and-so, brother so-and-so. Sister so-and-so was in a hospital, and they've called the family in. I'm on vacation. I need you to go to the hospital and pray with them. And I was like, I get my first ministry assignment. I was fired up. I was so excited. What an honor, right? And it is an honor. Like I've grown to really love and appreciate hospital visits and walking with people through the death of a loved one. Like those things are, it's a gift. I really mean that. But this first one was not a gift. Not at all. And so I was 20 years old, go down to Kingwood, and I go into the hospital. I make my way, and like every hospital is different. They have signage everywhere, but evidently none of it works because I was all over the place. I finally make my way to the room. I get to the room, and I walk in, and the whole family's gathered around the bed, and they're just having this moment. And I walk in, and no one told me, hey, Derek, here's what you say when you go to a hospital room, and here's like the bedside manner you need. None of that. Nobody, just throw me out there. Just let me die. So I walk into the room with the biggest smile on my face, like, how's everybody doing? I thought it was a fair question. The son did not. He was sitting at the bed, and he looks up at me, and he goes, how do you think we're doing? I was like, okay, I'm just going to go back to the church, right? That's an awkward moment, right? Like, I was trying to be sincere, right? I was trying to, like, how can I love these people? And in the middle of their grief, like, he's not trying to be harsh. He's not trying to be mean. He's just like, this is a horrible day. Why do I say that story is because there can be phrases that we use in the church world that may be true but don't always feel helpful in the moment. One of those phrases is, well, they're in a better place now. Is it true as a Christ follower? Absolutely. Should we celebrate that? Yes. But when somebody's family member passes away, it's not always the best thing to say, like, well, they're in a better place. Why? Because in the middle of that, you're walking through grief and pain and trying to process, like, why did this happen, or how did this happen? Like, it's not always the most helpful thing. And as we think about those statements that we might say, sure, it may be helpful with somebody that's later in life, their health declined, they've been in pain, but I'm talking like, these are like people that the unexpected happens. That phrase is not going to be helpful. It doesn't make it even easier when it is expected. But on the flip side of that, what I'm afraid that has happened is that we have unintentionally made small the greatest miracle that we could ever receive. We've unintentionally made small the greatest miracle that we could have ever received. Because we want to have good bedside manner, right? When we're visiting a friend or a family member in a hospital and we're going to the viewing and going to the funeral, we want to be cautious and kind and loving through all those things. But I'm afraid that because of our sensitivity to that, that we've downplayed the greatest miracle, because our healing, our rescuing from sin is the greatest miracle we could have ever received. It is the ultimate miracle. Psalm chapter 40, David writes this, who has made a mess of his life, right? David, the man after God's own heart, but it wasn't always beautiful, right? He made a mess. Adultery, murder, the whole bit, hiding, the whole thing. Verses 1-3, it says this: I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me, and he heard my cry. Look at the verse 2. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth and a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. David's words shout the truth of what we have known for our own spiritual condition. And what we know to be true is that without the work of God, without his saving grace, we are deep in the muck and the mud of our own sin and destruction. Full of despair. And I want to encourage you this morning, don't downplay the greatest miracle that's ever taken place in our life. Don't downplay it. God may not heal somebody the way that we want him to, but if they are a follower of Jesus, I can promise you, when they step into the presence of God, there is nothing lacking. There's no more pain. There's no more sorrow. And yes, they're in a better place than we are. Fourth thing is this. Al, you can come. Is that Elam comes after Mara. Elam comes after, what I mean by that, let's look at verse 27 of Exodus 15. They came to Elam where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. We don't always have the answer to why God doesn't heal some and he heals others and all the things that we wrestle with, right? Or why he heals some only through eternal glory, but doesn't heal them physically in their life in that moment, in that time, that lifetime. But we can know this, is that whether he performs a miracle or he doesn't, Elam is coming. Let's look at what Elam is. Elam, we don't know the exact location of this place. Moses gives some detail, but you see it. There's 12 springs of water. There's 70 palm trees. There's shade in the middle of the desert. Think about that for a minute. That's pretty incredible. There's 12 springs that they're drinking from. They're getting their fill of water themselves, their animals. It's a picture of abundance. From one bitter water source to 12 springs with clean water. Elam was a gift to the people. It says I love this picture. It says the people camped there. Think about all that the Israelites had been through. Egypt, Pharaoh, wandering in the wilderness, coming to a bitter well. They come to this place called Elam. It says they camp by the water. I don't know if you have a special place that you go to that just gives you that same kind of feeling of just like restfulness and refreshment. And I know this as a parent, vacations are great, but taking your kids to places like Disney World, it's not refreshment, is it? You're tired, you're worn out. My mind goes to the mountains or the beach or something like that, where it's like you hear the waves rolling in. You go to the mountains, like you're sitting on top of the mountain looking out at the mountainscape, and it's like you don't even have cell service. You can't respond to anything. You can't pick your phone up. It's just like the Israelites encamped at Elam. Here's what I want to say is that Elam was a gift to the people, for sure, but Elam was also only a foretaste of the land of Canaan. Don't forget, Israelites are not staying at Elam. They're on their way to the land of Canaan, to the promised land. This land flowing with milk and honey, this land of abundance, this land with fertile ground. And so it is with us. If we see a miracle, it is only a foretaste. If God intervenes in a miraculous way, it is only a foretaste of what is to come. Because when we reach our promised land, there's going to be nothing lacking in our lives. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to a day and a time where I don't have to worry about sickness. I don't have to worry about pain. I don't have to worry about mental health. I don't have to worry about all the failures in my life. I can be pure and holy before the Lord in his presence, complete wholeness. Here's where I want to land, though. You don't get to Elam without making it through the desert. You don't get to Elam. You don't get to the land of refreshment without making it through the desert. You don't get to Elam without first tasting the bitter water of Marah. And here's the thing. Life has a funny way, doesn't it? It seems like pouring bitter water into our hearts and souls. Situations, sickness, pain. But it's walking through that desert with the Good Shepherd that leads us to the promised land. If he intervenes in the meantime, it's a foretaste. But we got to remember and remind ourselves that we are not living for what is on this earth. We are living to be complete and whole for eternity in the presence of our Creator in the promised land. God's healing power is not constrained by human action or human plans.